The Story of Margaret Garner and the Horror of Slavery. Where are you watching from, your city and your country? Tell us in the comments. And please subscribe, like, and share this video so we can get this story across a wider audience and rewrite the false history we were told. Now listen closely, because this story will take you into a world of fear, courage, and impossible choices, a story that will stay with you long after it ends. It begins in a time when freedom was not a right but a dream, in a place where human beings were treated as property, bought and sold like animals. And in this dark world lived a young woman named Margaret Garner. She was born into slavery in the state of Kentucky in the early 1800s, and from the very beginning her life was controlled by others. She did not choose where to go, what to do, or even who she would become. Her days were filled with hard labor, long hours in the fields under the burning sun, and nights filled with fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of never knowing what tomorrow would bring. But even in this life, Margaret had something powerful inside her, something that slavery could not take away: her love for her children. She had several children, and each one meant everything to her. They were her reason to survive, her reason to hope, but also her greatest fear, because in slavery, children could be taken away at any moment, sold to another place, never to be seen again. And Margaret had seen it happen before. She had seen mothers cry until they could no longer stand. She had seen children scream as they were dragged away, and she knew that one day it could happen to her. And this fear lived inside her every single day, growing stronger, heavier, harder to ignore. And as time passed, Margaret began to hear whispers of freedom, whispers of a place across the river where slavery did not exist, a place called Ohio, where people like her could live as free human beings. At first, these whispers felt like dreams, something too far away to ever reach. But slowly the idea began to grow inside her mind. What if she could escape? What if she could take her children and run? What if they could all be free? But escape was not easy. It was dangerous. Many had tried, and many had failed. Those who were caught faced terrible punishment. Some were beaten, some were chained, some were sold far away, never to return. And yet the thought of freedom refused to leave her. It stayed with her day and night, whispering to her, calling her, pushing her. And one winter night, in January of 1856, everything changed. The air was cold, the ground was hard, and the Ohio River was frozen, and Margaret saw her chance with her husband Robert and their children. She made a decision that would change everything. They would run, they would risk everything for freedom. Under the cover of darkness, they escaped, moving quickly, quietly, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow looked like danger. But they kept going step by step, breath by breath, until they reached the frozen river. It was their only path to freedom. But it was also dangerous. The ice could break. The cold could kill them. But turning back was not an option, and so they stepped onto the ice, slowly, carefully moving forward. Each step felt like a lifetime. The cold wind cut through their clothes, their feet slipped, their bodies shook. But they did not stop. They could not stop, because on the other side was freedom. And after what felt like forever, they made it across. They had reached Ohio. They had reached a free state. But freedom was not as simple as crossing a river, because the law known as the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in free states they were not safe. They could still be captured and returned to slavery, and Margaret knew this. But for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to hope. They found shelter in a small house in Cincinnati with the help of others who believed in freedom, people who risked their own safety to help those escaping slavery. And for a short time, Margaret and her family felt something they had never truly felt before, a sense of peace, a sense of possibility, a sense that Maybe, just maybe, their nightmare was over. But outside the house, danger was already closing in. Word had spread. Slave catchers were searching, and it would not be long before they found them. And as the morning came, the sound of footsteps filled the air, heavy boots, loud voices, the sound of men who had come to take them back. And in that moment, everything changed again. The fear returned stronger than ever. The hope began to fade, and Margaret realized that the freedom she had reached was slipping away, and what she would do next would shock the world forever. The sound of boots grew louder and closer. Voices shouted outside the house. Orders were given. Doors were forced open. And in that moment, Margaret Garner understood that there was no more time. The men had come to take her and her children back to slavery, back to a life of pain and control, back to a world where her children would be treated as property. And something inside her mind shifted in a way that no one outside that moment could fully understand. Her fear turned into a cold and desperate clarity. She looked at her children and saw not just their faces, but their future, a future of chains, separation, suffering, and she could not accept it. She could not allow it. The room filled with noise, footsteps rushing in, commands being shouted. Her husband Robert tried to hold the door, tried to slow them down, but it was only a matter of seconds, and Margaret moved quickly, her hands shaking yet determined, her breath heavy yet focused. She gathered her children close, whispering to them in a voice filled with love and urgency, her heart breaking with every second that passed. Outside, the door began to crack under the force, wood splitting, hinges breaking. And then, in a moment that would echo through history, Margaret made a choice that no mother should ever have to make. She chose what she believed was the only way to save her children from a fate worse than the life they would be forced into. She acted with speed, driven by fear and love. And before the men could reach her, she ended the life of her young daughter and tried to do the same for her other children. But the men burst in, grabbing her, stopping her, pulling her away as chaos filled the room. Voices rose in shock and confusion. Some of the men froze, unable to understand what they had just seen. Others reacted with force, restraining her, shouting orders, while Margaret struggled not in rage, but in desperation, trying to reach her children, trying to finish what she had started, because in her mind she believed she was protecting them. The room fell into a strange silence after the struggle, a silence filled with shock and something deeper that many could not name. The men had come, expecting fear and submission, but instead they were faced with a truth they could not ignore, the reality of what slavery had done to a mother's mind, the reality of a system so cruel that it could push love into a place of terrible decision. And Margaret was taken into custody, along with her family, her surviving children clinging to her, crying and confused. And as they were led outside, the cold air hit them hard. Crowds had already begun to gather, people whispering, pointing, trying to understand what had happened inside that house. And word spread quickly through the city, faster than anyone could control. By the time the sun was higher in the sky, the story had reached newspapers and homes. People argued in streets and in homes. Some said she was a monster. Others said she was a mother pushed beyond human limits. And as the hours turned into days, her case became something larger than anyone expected. It became a symbol, a question that no one could answer easily. What is freedom worth, and what happens when it is taken away for so long that a person begins to see no path back to it? Lawyers arrived, officials gathered, and the legal system prepared to decide her fate. But even the law seemed unsure of how to handle what had happened, because on one side she was considered property under the Fugitive Slave Act, and on the other side she was a person who had committed an act in a free state. And this contradiction confused and divided even those who believed strongly in the law. Some argued that she should be tried in Ohio as a criminal. Others insisted she must be returned to her enslaver in Kentucky. And the courtroom became a place of tension. Filled with people waiting to see which path would be chosen, Margaret sat quietly through it all, her face calm yet distant, as if her mind had already traveled far beyond the walls of the court. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not loud but clear, and she made it known that she did what she believed was right for her children. She spoke of the fear of slavery, of the pain of families being torn apart, of the life she could not allow her children to return to. And her words did not shout, but they carried weight. They settled into the room and stayed there, forcing everyone to feel something whether they wanted to or not. And as the case continued, more people came forward, some to speak for her, others to speak against her. The city became divided. Conversations grew louder, emotions stronger, and beyond the city, the story continued to spread, reaching places far away, making people question what they believed about slavery. And as the final day approached, the tension in the courtroom could be felt in every breath, every movement. The judge prepared to give his decision, a decision that would not only determine Margaret's fate, but would also reveal the power of the law over human life. And when the decision was finally given, it came with a weight that silenced the room. The court ruled that Margaret Garner would not be tried in Ohio, but would be returned to Kentucky as property. And in that moment, the law made its position clear. It chose ownership over humanity. It chose system over suffering. And Margaret was led away once again, not as a free woman, but as someone returned to the very life she had tried to escape. And as she walked out of the courtroom, there was no resistance in her steps, only a quiet strength, a strength that came from knowing she had made her choice. And though the world around her had judged her, her story was far from over, because what had happened would not be forgotten, and the ripple of that moment would continue to spread in ways no one could yet see, shaping thoughts, changing minds, and leaving a mark that time would never erase. The journey back to Kentucky began in silence, a heavy silence that wrapped itself around Margaret Garner and her family like a shadow that would not leave. The chains of the law had closed around them once again, and though the land they passed through looked wide and open, every step felt narrow and confined, as if the world itself had shrunk to the space allowed by those who claimed ownership over them. Margaret held her surviving children close during the journey, her arms firm, her eyes distant yet watchful, as if she was guarding them from something that could still reach out at any moment. Even after everything that had happened, the cold air of winter lingered, and the roads were rough. Each movement forward felt like a step deeper into a place she had tried to escape, and those who escorted them treated the journey as routine, as if they were simply moving goods from one place to another, and that alone showed the deep truth of the system, that human lives could be reduced to objects without thought or pause. But Margaret's mind was far from routine. It moved between memory and fear, between what had happened and what could still happen, and at times her grip on her children tightened, as if she feared they might disappear, as if someone might take them again in a way she could not stop. And along the way, whispers followed them. People had heard of the story. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with judgment, some with a quiet understanding that needed no words, but none of that changed her path. None of it opened a door, and when they finally reached Kentucky, the air itself seemed heavier. The fields stretched wide, the houses stood tall, but everything carried the weight of control, the place where her life had been shaped and where it would continue under the same system that had driven her to her breaking point. And when she was returned to the plantation, there was no welcome, no acknowledgement of her pain, only the continuation of rules, orders, and expectations, as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not heard her story, as if the moment that had shaken so many was just a small interruption in the routine of ownership. And yet something had changed, not in the system, but in the eyes of those who watched her. Some avoided her gaze, others stared too long, unsure of what they were seeing, because Margaret was no longer just another enslaved woman. She had become something more difficult to define, something that carried both fear and respect. And even those who believed in the system could not fully ignore what her actions represented. And as the days passed, Margaret returned to work, her body moving through familiar tasks, but her mind was no longer bound in the same way. There was a distance in her that could not be closed, a quiet strength that did not show itself in loud defiance, but in a steady refusal to be broken. And her children stayed close to her, rarely leaving her side, their bond stronger, shaped by what they had survived. And in the nights when the world grew quiet, the weight of memory would return, not in loud sounds, but in soft echoes, in the feeling of a moment that could not be undone. And though no words were spoken about it, the presence of that moment lived in the space around them, shaping every look, every movement, every silence. And beyond the plantation, the story continued to grow. It traveled through newspapers, through conversations, through meetings where people spoke about slavery and what it truly meant. And those who fought against slavery used her story to show the world the depth of its cruelty. They spoke of a mother pushed to a place where her only choice felt like a terrible decision. They asked questions that could not be easily answered, and people who had once seen slavery as distant began to feel its reality in a new way. And this created tension, not just between regions, but within communities, within families, within minds, because the story of Margaret Garner did not allow for simple understanding. It forced people to face the human cost of a system they had accepted or ignored. And while these debates grew, Margaret remained where she was, living day by day under the same control. Yet something in her presence remained unbroken, and time moved forward. Seasons changed. The cold of winter gave way to warmer days and then to heat. And with the change of seasons came new challenges. The river that had once been frozen would no longer hold. Escape would not come the same way again. And yet the idea of freedom never fully left her. It remained like a quiet flame, not always visible, but never gone. And there were moments when the unexpected would rise again, moments when the ordinary would shift into something uncertain. And one such moment came when Margaret and her family were moved once more, placed on a boat to be taken further south, away from the place where her story had begun, away from the river that had once offered a path. And the journey on the water carried its own tension, the movement of the boat steady yet uneasy, the sense that they were being taken deeper into a world that offered fewer chances. And as the boat moved forward, the sky began to change. Clouds gathered. The wind shifted. And what had begun as a calm journey slowly turned into something more dangerous. The water grew rough, the air heavy, and those on the boat began to react. Voices raised, movements quickened, and Margaret held her children close once again, her eyes watching everything, her body ready, because she had learned that danger did not always come with warning. Sometimes it arrived suddenly, changing everything in a moment. And as the storm grew stronger, the boat struggled. The waves pushed against it. The wind tore through the air, and in that chaos the line between control and loss began to blur. People moved in fear, shouting, trying to hold on. And for a brief moment, the power that had controlled her life seemed to weaken as nature itself took over. And in that moment, something unexpected happened, something that would once again shift the path of her story in a way no one could predict. Because when systems rely on control, they often forget that there are forces beyond their reach. And as the storm reached its peak, the future became uncertain, and the story of Margaret Garner moved once again into a place where anything could happen and nothing could be taken for granted. And it is in these moments that the true nature of strength is revealed. Not in what is said, but in what is endured. Not in what is planned, but in what is faced when plans fall apart. And as the storm continued to rise and the boat fought to stay above the water, the question returned once more. What does freedom truly mean, and how far will a person go to protect it? When every path seems closed, and as the wind roared and the water crashed against the sides of the boat, Margaret stood in the center of it all, holding on not just to her children, but to the part of herself that refused to disappear, no matter how many times the world tried to take it away. And in that moment, her story moved forward again, not toward an ending, but toward something deeper, something that would leave a mark not just on her life, but on the lives of all who would come to know it. The storm did not end quickly. It raged with a force that made every second feel uncertain. The boat groaned under the pressure of the waves, the wood creaked, ropes snapped, and the people on board moved in fear and confusion, trying to hold on to anything that could keep them steady. And in the middle of it all, Margaret Garner stood with her children, her arms wrapped around them, her body braced against the movement, her eyes fixed not on the chaos, but on survival, because she had already faced a storm greater than this, a storm of the mind and the heart, and she knew that fear could not control her, not anymore. And as the wind howled and the rain fell hard against their skin, the boat tilted dangerously. Water rushed across the deck, and voices cried out, some calling for help, some calling for mercy, but nature did not listen. It moved with its own power, its own purpose. And in that moment, the control that slavery depended on began to break apart, because no man could command the storm, no law could stop the waves, and for a brief and powerful moment, all were equal in the face of what was happening. And then it happened. A sudden violent shift. The boat struck something beneath the water. A deep crack echoed, and the structure began to fail. Panic spread quickly. People pushed, grabbed, tried to find safety, and Margaret felt the movement change beneath her feet. She knew that this was more than just danger. This was collapse, and without hesitation she moved, pulling her children close, guiding them toward anything that could float, anything that could keep them above the water. The boat broke further, pieces of wood separated, and people were thrown into the river. The cold water swallowed them, the sound of the storm mixing with cries and splashes, and Margaret entered the water with her children. The cold hit hard, stealing breath, slowing movement. But she did not stop. She held on, using every bit of strength she had left, pushing against the current, keeping their heads above the surface, and time seemed to stretch. Every moment filled with effort, every breath a fight, and slowly the storm began to ease, the wind softened, the waves calmed, and what remained was silence, broken only by the sound of water and distant movement. And Margaret found herself clinging to a piece of wood, her children close, alive, and for a moment there was stillness, a quiet that felt almost unreal after the chaos. And as the light returned and the storm passed, others began to appear, scattered, exhausted, some calling out, some too weak to speak, and eventually help came, boats from nearby areas moving in to gather survivors, pulling them from the water, bringing them to shore, and Margaret and her children were among those saved. Their bodies cold, their strength nearly gone, but their lives still held. And as they were brought onto land, something had changed. The journey that was meant to carry them deeper into the system had been broken, the path interrupted, and in that interruption there was uncertainty. Officials tried to regain control, to organize, to account for those who remained. But the storm had scattered more than just people. It had scattered order, and in that confusion, time moved differently. Decisions delayed, attention divided, and in that space, Margaret found something rare, a moment where the tight grip of control had loosened, And though she was still under watch, still not free, the world around her was not as certain as it had been before, and days passed as survivors recovered, as plans were made to continue the journey. And during those days, Margaret observed everything: the movements of those in charge, the spaces where attention faded, the times when watchfulness weakened, because she had learned that survival was not only about strength but about awareness. And as her body regained strength, her mind sharpened, and the idea that had once driven her returned once more, not with the same urgency, but with a steady, quiet presence, the idea of freedom. And one night, when the air was calm and the world seemed to rest, Margaret made another decision. Not driven by panic, but by careful thought, she gathered her children close, moving slowly, quietly, using the shadows, using the knowledge she had gained, and step by step she moved away from the place where she had been kept, not running but moving with purpose.